1. The Women's Evangelistic Corps. Of all the daring things which Jesus did in connection with his earth career, the most amazing was his sudden announcement on the evening of January 16, "On the morrow we will set apart 10 women for the ministering work of the kingdom." At the beginning of the 2 weeks period during which the apostles and the evangelists were to be absent from Bethsaida on their furlough, Jesus requested David to summon his parents back to their home and to dispatch messengers calling to Bethsaida 10 devout women who had served in the administration of the former encampment and the tented infirmary. These women had all listened to the instruction given the young evangelists, but it had never occurred to either themselves or their teachers that Jesus would dare to commission women to teach the gospel of the kingdom and minister to the sick. These 10 women selected and commissioned by Jesus were Susanna, the daughter of the former Chazan of the Nazareth synagogue; Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the steward of Herod Antipas; Elizabeth, the daughter of a wealthy Jew of Tiberias and Sepphoris; Martha, the elder sister of Andrew and Peter; Rachel, the sister-in-law of Jude, the Master's brother in the flesh; Nasanta, the daughter of Elman, the Syrian physician; Milcah, a cousin of the Apostle Thomas; Ruth, the eldest daughter of Matthew Levi; Celta, the daughter of a Roman centurion; and Agamon, a widow of Damascus. Subsequently, Jesus added 2 other women to this group, Mary Magdalene and Rebecca, the daughter of Joseph of Arimathea. Jesus authorized these women to effect their own organization and directed Judas to provide funds for their equipment and for pack animals. The 10 elected Susanna as their chief and Joanna as their treasurer. From this time on, they furnished their own funds. Never again did they draw upon Judas for support. It was most astounding in that day, when women were not even allowed on the main floor of the synagogue, being confined to the women's gallery, to behold them being recognized as authorized teachers of the new gospel of the kingdom. The charge which Jesus gave these 10 women, as he set them apart for gospel teaching and ministry, was the Emancipation Proclamation, which set free all women and for all time. No more was man to look upon woman as his spiritual inferior. This was a decided shock to even the 12 apostles. Notwithstanding, they had many times heard the Master say that in the kingdom of heaven there is neither rich nor poor, free nor bond, male nor female. All are equally the sons and daughters of God. They were literally stunned when he proposed formally to commission these 10 women as religious teachers and even to permit their traveling about with them. The whole country was stirred up by this proceeding, the enemies of Jesus making great capital out of this move. But everywhere the women believers in the good news stood staunchly behind their chosen sisters and voiced no uncertain approval of this tardy acknowledgement of woman's place in religious work. And this liberation of women, giving them due recognition, was practiced by the apostles immediately after the Master's departure, albeit they fell back to the olden customs in subsequent generations. Throughout the early days of the Christian Church, women teachers and ministers were called deaconesses and were accorded general recognition. But Paul, despite the fact that he conceded all this in theory, never really incorporated it into his own attitude, and personally found it difficult to carry out in practice. 2. The Stop at Magdala. As the apostolic party journeyed from Bethsaida, the women traveled in the rear. During the conference time, they always sat in a group in front and to the right of the speaker. Increasingly, women had become believers in the gospel of the kingdom, and it had been a source of much difficulty and no end of embarrassment when they had desired to hold personal converse with Jesus or one of the apostles. Now all this was changed. When any of the women believers desired to see the Master or confer with the apostles, they went to Susanna, and in company with one of the 12 women evangelists, they would go at once into the presence of the Master or one of his apostles. It was at Magdala that the women first demonstrated their usefulness and vindicated the wisdom of their choosing. Andrew had imposed rather strict rules upon his associates about doing personal work with women, especially with those of questionable character. When the party entered Magdala, these 10 women evangelists were free to enter the evil resorts and preach the glad tidings directly to all their inmates. And when visiting the sick, these women were able to draw very close in their ministry to their afflicted sisters. As the result of the ministry of these 10 women, afterward known as the 12 women, at this place, Mary Magdalene was won for the kingdom. Through a succession of misfortunes and in consequence of the attitude of reputable society toward women who commit such errors of judgment, this woman had found herself in one of the nefarious resorts of Magdala. It was Martha and Rachel who made plain to Mary that the doors of the kingdom were open to even such as she. Mary believed the good news and was baptized by Peter the next day. Mary Magdalene became the most effective teacher of the gospel among this group of 12 women evangelists. She was set apart for such service, together with Rebecca, at Jotapata, about 4 weeks subsequent to her conversion. Mary and Rebecca, with the others of this group, went on through the remainder of Jesus' life on earth, laboring faithfully and effectively for the enlightenment and uplifting of their downtrodden sisters. And when the last and tragic episode in the drama of Jesus' life was being enacted, notwithstanding the apostles all fled but one, these women were all present, and not one either denied or betrayed him.
3. Those who saw the crucifixion. At about 9:30 this Friday morning, Jesus was hung upon the cross. Before 11 o'clock, upward of 1,000 persons had assembled to witness this spectacle of the crucifixion of the Son of Man. Throughout these dreadful hours, the unseen hosts of a universe stood in silence while they gazed upon this extraordinary phenomenon of the Creator as he was dying the death of the creature, even the most ignoble death of a condemned criminal. Standing near the cross at one time or another during the crucifixion were Mary, Ruth, Jude, John, Salome, John's mother, and a group of earnest women believers, including Mary, the wife of Clopas and sister of Jesus' mother, Mary Magdalene and Rebecca, one time of Sepphoris. These and other friends of Jesus held their peace while they witnessed his great patience and fortitude and gazed upon his intense sufferings. Many who passed by wagged their heads and, railing at him, said, "You who would destroy the temple and build it again in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, why do you not come down from your cross?" In like manner, some of the rulers of the Jews mocked him, saying, "He saved others, but himself he cannot save." Others said, "If you are the King of the Jews, come down from the cross, and we will believe in you." And later on they mocked him the more, saying, "He trusted in God to deliver him. He even claimed to be the Son of God. Look at him now, crucified between 2 thieves." Even the 2 thieves also railed at him and cast reproach upon him. Inasmuch as Jesus would make no reply to their taunts, and since it was nearing noontime of this special preparation day, by 11:30 most of the jesting and jeering crowd had gone its way. Less than 50 persons remained on the scene. The soldiers now prepared to eat lunch and drink their cheap, sour wine as they settled down for the long death watch. As they partook of their wine, they derisively offered a toast to Jesus, saying, "Hail and good fortune to the King of the Jews!" And they were astonished at the Master's tolerant regard of their ridicule and mocking. When Jesus saw them eat and drink, he looked down upon them and said, "I thirst." When the captain of the guard heard Jesus say, "I thirst," he took some of the wine from his bottle, and putting the saturated sponge stopper upon the end of a javelin, raised it to Jesus so that he could moisten his parched lips. Jesus had purposed to live without resort to his supernatural power, and he likewise elected to die as an ordinary mortal upon the cross. He had lived as a man, and he would die as a man, doing the Father's will. 4. The Thief on the Cross. One of the brigands railed at Jesus, saying, "If you are the Son of God, why do you not save yourself and us?" But when he had reproached Jesus, the other thief, who had many times heard the Master teach, said, "Do you have no fear even of God? Do you not see that we are suffering justly for our deeds, but that this man suffers unjustly? Better that we should seek forgiveness for our sins and salvation for our souls." When Jesus heard the thief say this, he turned his face toward him and smiled approvingly. When the malefactor saw the face of Jesus turned toward him, he mustered up his courage, fanned the flickering flame of his faith, and said, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And then Jesus said, "Verily, verily, I say to you today, you shall sometime be with me in paradise." The Master had time, amidst the pangs of mortal death, to listen to the faith confession of the believing brigand. When this thief reached out for salvation, he found deliverance. Many times before this he had been constrained to believe in Jesus, but only in these last hours of consciousness did he turn with a whole heart toward the Master's teaching. When he saw the manner in which Jesus faced death upon the cross, this thief could no longer resist the conviction that this Son of Man was indeed the Son of God. During this episode of the conversion and reception of the thief into the kingdom by Jesus, the Apostle John was absent, having gone into the city to bring his mother and her friends to the scene of the crucifixion. Luke subsequently heard this story from the converted Roman captain of the guard. The Apostle John told about the crucifixion as he remembered the event 2/3 of a century after its occurrence. The other records were based upon the recital of the Roman centurion on duty, who, because of what he saw and heard, subsequently believed in Jesus and entered into the full fellowship of the kingdom of heaven on earth. This young man, the penitent brigand, had been led into a life of violence and wrongdoing by those who extolled such a career of robbery as an effective patriotic protest against political oppression and social injustice. And this sort of teaching, plus the urge for adventure, led many otherwise well-meaning youths to enlist in these daring expeditions of robbery. This young man had looked upon Barabbas as a hero. Now he saw that he had been mistaken. Here on the cross beside him, he saw a really great man, a true hero. Here was a hero who fired his zeal and inspired his highest ideals of moral self-respect and quickened all his ideals of courage, manhood, and bravery. In beholding Jesus, there sprang up in his heart an overwhelming sense of love, loyalty, and genuine greatness. And if any other person among the jeering crowd had experienced the birth of faith within his soul, and had appealed to the mercy of Jesus, he would have been received with the same loving consideration that was displayed toward the believing brigand. Just after the repentant thief heard the Master's promise that they should sometime meet in paradise, John returned from the city, bringing with him his mother and a company of almost a dozen women believers. John took up his position near Mary, the mother of Jesus, supporting her. Her son Jude stood on the other side. As Jesus looked down upon this scene, it was noontide, and he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And speaking to John, he said, "My son, behold your mother." And then he addressed them both, saying, "I desire that you depart from this place." And so John and Jude led Mary away from Golgotha. John took the mother of Jesus to the place where he tarried in Jerusalem, and then hastened back to the scene of the crucifixion. After the Passover, Mary returned to Bethsaida, where she lived at John's home for the rest of her natural life. Mary did not live quite 1 year after the death of Jesus. After Mary left, the other women withdrew for a short distance, and remained in attendance upon Jesus until he expired on the cross, and they were yet standing by when the body of the Master was taken down for burial. 5. Last hour on the cross. Although it was early in the season for such a phenomenon, shortly after 12 o'clock the sky darkened by reason of the fine sand in the air. The people of Jerusalem knew that this meant the coming of one of those hot-wind sandstorms from the Arabian desert. Before 1 o'clock the sky was so dark the sun was hid, and the remainder of the crowd hastened back to the city. When the Master gave up his life shortly after this hour, less than 30 people were present, only the 13 Roman soldiers and a group of about 15 believers. These believers were all women except 2, Jude, Jesus' brother, and John Zebedee, who returned to the scene just before the Master expired. Shortly after 1 o'clock, amidst the increasing darkness of the fierce sandstorm, Jesus began to fail in human consciousness. His last words of mercy, forgiveness, and admonition had been spoken. His last wish concerning the care of his mother had been expressed. During this hour of approaching death, the human mind of Jesus resorted to the repetition of many passages in the Hebrew Scriptures, particularly the Psalms. The last conscious thought of the human Jesus was concerned with the repetition in his mind of a portion of the book of Psalms now known as the 20th, 21st, and 22nd Psalms. While his lips would often move, he was too weak to utter the words as these passages, which he so well knew by heart, would pass through his mind. Only a few times did those standing by catch some utterance, such as, "I know the Lord will save his anointed," "Your hand shall find out all my enemies," and my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus did not for one moment entertain the slightest doubt that he had lived in accordance with the Father's will, and he never doubted that he was now laying down his life in the flesh in accordance with his Father's will. He did not feel that the Father had forsaken him. He was merely reciting in his vanishing consciousness many scriptures, among them this 22nd Psalm, which begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And this happened to be one of the 3 passages which were spoken with sufficient clearness to be heard by those standing by. The last request which the mortal Jesus made of his fellows was about 1:30, when, a second time, he said, "I thirst," and the same captain of the guard again moistened his lips with the same sponge wet in the sour wine, in those days commonly called vinegar. The sandstorm grew in intensity, and the heavens increasingly darkened. Still the soldiers and the small group of believers stood by. The soldiers crouched near the cross, huddled together to protect themselves from the cutting sand. The mother of John and others watched from a distance, where they were somewhat sheltered by an overhanging rock. When the Master finally breathed his last, there were present at the foot of his cross John Zebedee, his brother Jude, his sister Ruth, Mary Magdalene, and Rebecca, one time of Sepphoris. It was just before 3:00 when Jesus, with a loud voice, cried out, "It is finished. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And when he had thus spoken, he bowed his head and gave up the life struggle. When the Roman centurion saw how Jesus died, he smote his breast and said, "This was indeed a righteous man. Truly he must have been a Son of God." And from that hour he began to believe in Jesus. Jesus died royally, as he had lived. He freely admitted his kingship and remained master of the situation throughout the tragic day. He went willingly to his ignominious death after he had provided for the safety of his chosen apostles. He wisely restrained Peter's trouble-making violence and provided that John might be near him right up to the end of his mortal existence. He revealed his true nature to the murderous Sanhedrin and reminded Pilate of the source of his sovereign authority as a son of God. He started out to Golgotha bearing his own crossbeam, and finished up his loving bestowal by handing over his spirit of mortal acquirement to the Paradise Father. After such a life, and at such a death, the Master could truly say, "It is finished." Because this was the preparation day for both the Passover and the Sabbath, the Jews did not want these bodies to be exposed on Golgotha. Therefore they went before Pilate asking that the legs of these 3 men be broken, that they be dispatched, so that they could be taken down from their crosses and cast into the criminal burial pits before sundown. When Pilate heard this request, he forthwith sent 3 soldiers to break the legs and dispatch Jesus and the 2 brigands. When these soldiers arrived at Golgotha, they did accordingly to the 2 thieves, but they found Jesus already dead, much to their surprise. However, in order to make sure of his death, one of the soldiers pierced his left side with his spear. Though it was common for the victims of crucifixion to linger alive upon the cross for even 2 or 3 days, the overwhelming emotional agony and the acute spiritual anguish of Jesus brought an end to his mortal life in the flesh in a little less than 5½ hours. 6. After the crucifixion. In the midst of the darkness of the sandstorm, about 3:30, David Zebedee sent out the last of the messengers carrying the news of the Master's death. The last of his runners he dispatched to the home of Martha and Mary in Bethany, where he supposed the mother of Jesus stopped with the rest of her family. After the death of the Master, John sent the women, in charge of Jude, to the home of Elijah Mark, where they tarried over the Sabbath day. John himself, being well known by this time to the Roman centurion, remained at Golgotha until Joseph and Nicodemus arrived on the scene, with an order from Pilate authorizing them to take possession of the body of Jesus. Thus ended a day of tragedy and sorrow for a vast universe whose myriads of intelligences had shuddered at the shocking spectacle of the crucifixion of the human incarnation of their beloved sovereign. They were stunned by this exhibition of mortal callousness and human perversity.
Discovery of the empty tomb. As we approach the time of the resurrection of Jesus on this early Sunday morning, it should be recalled that the 10 apostles were sojourning at the home of Elijah and Mary Mark, where they were asleep in the upper chamber, resting on the very couches whereon they reclined during the Last Supper with their Master. This Sunday morning they were all there assembled except Thomas. Thomas was with them for a few minutes late Saturday night when they first got together, but the sight of the apostles, coupled with the thought of what had happened to Jesus, was too much for him. He looked his associates over and immediately left the room, going to the home of Simon in Bethphage, where he thought to grieve over his troubles in solitude. The apostles all suffered, not so much from doubt and despair as from fear, grief, and shame. At the home of Nicodemus there were gathered together, with David Zebedee and Joseph of Arimathea, some 12 or 15 of the more prominent of the Jerusalem disciples of Jesus. At the home of Joseph of Arimathea there were some 15 or 20 of the leading women believers. Only these women abode in Joseph's house, and they had kept close within during the hours of the Sabbath day and the evening after the Sabbath, so that they were ignorant of the military guard on watch at the tomb. Neither did they know that a second stone had been rolled in front of the tomb, and that both of these stones had been placed under the seal of Pilate. A little before 3 o'clock this Sunday morning, when the first signs of day began to appear in the east, 5 of the women started out for the tomb of Jesus. They had prepared an abundance of special embalming lotions, and they carried many linen bandages with them. It was their purpose more thoroughly to give the body of Jesus its death anointing and more carefully to wrap it up with the new bandages. The women who went on this mission of anointing Jesus' body were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of the Alphaeus twins, Salome the mother of the Zebedee brothers, Joanna the wife of Chuza, and Susanna the daughter of Ezra of Alexandria. It was about 3:30 when the 5 women, laden with their ointments, arrived before the empty tomb. As they passed out of the Damascus gate, they encountered a number of soldiers fleeing into the city more or less panic-stricken, and this caused them to pause for a few minutes. But when nothing more developed, they resumed their journey. They were greatly surprised to see the stone rolled away from the entrance to the tomb, inasmuch as they had said among themselves on the way out, "Who will help us roll away the stone?" They set down their burdens and began to look upon one another in fear and with great amazement. While they stood there, a-tremble with fear, Mary Magdalene ventured around the smaller stone and dared to enter the open sepulchre. This tomb of Joseph was in his garden on the hillside on the eastern side of the road, and it also faced toward the east. By this hour there was just enough of the dawn of a new day to enable Mary to look back to the place where the Master's body had lain, and to discern that it was gone. In the recess of stone where they had laid Jesus, Mary saw only the folded napkin where his head had rested, and the bandages wherewith he had been wrapped lying intact, and as they had rested on the stone before the celestial hosts removed the body. The covering sheet lay at the foot of the burial niche. After Mary had tarried in the doorway of the tomb for a few moments, she did not see distinctly when she first entered the tomb, she saw that Jesus' body was gone, and in its place only these grave cloths, and she uttered a cry of alarm and anguish. All the women were exceedingly nervous. They had been on edge ever since meeting the panicky soldiers at the city gate, and when Mary uttered this scream of anguish, they were terror-stricken and fled in great haste. And they did not stop until they had run all the way to the Damascus gate. By this time, Joanna was conscience-stricken that they had deserted Mary. She rallied her companions, and they started back for the tomb. As they drew near the sepulchre, the frightened Magdalene, who was even more terrorized when she failed to find her sisters waiting when she came out of the tomb, now rushed up to them, excitedly exclaiming, "He is not there! They have taken him away!" And she led them back to the tomb, and they all entered and saw that it was empty. All 5 of the women then sat down on the stone near the entrance and talked over the situation. It had not yet occurred to them that Jesus had been resurrected. They had been by themselves over the Sabbath, and they conjectured that the body had been moved to another resting place. But when they pondered such a solution of their dilemma, They were at a loss to account for the orderly arrangement of the grave cloths. How could the body have been removed, since the very bandages in which it was wrapped were left in position and apparently intact on the burial shelf? As these women sat there in the early hours of the dawn of this new day, they looked to one side and observed a silent and motionless stranger. For a moment they were again frightened, but Mary Magdalene, rushing toward him and addressing him as if she thought he might be the caretaker of the garden, said, "Where have you taken the Master? Where have they laid him? Tell us that we may go and get him." When the stranger did not answer Mary, she began to weep. Then spoke Jesus to them, saying, "Whom do you seek?" Mary said, "We seek for Jesus who was laid to rest in Joseph's tomb, but he is gone. Do you know where they have taken him?" Then said Jesus, "Did not this Jesus tell you, even in Galilee, that he would die, but that he would rise again?" These words startled the women, but the Master was so changed that they did not yet recognize him with his back turned to the dim light. And as they pondered his words, he addressed the Magdalene with a familiar voice, saying, "Mary." And when she heard that word of well-known sympathy and affectionate greeting, she knew it was the voice of the Master, and she rushed to kneel at his feet while she exclaimed, "My Lord and my Master!" And all of the other women recognized that it was the Master who stood before them in glorified form, and they quickly knelt before him. These human eyes were enabled to see the Urantia form of Jesus because of the special ministry of the transformers and the midwayers in association with certain of the Urantia personalities then accompanying Jesus. As Mary sought to embrace his feet, Jesus said, "Touch me not, Mary, for I am not as you knew me in the flesh. In this form will I tarry with you for a season before I ascend to the Father. But go all of you now and tell my apostles, and Peter, that I have risen, and that you have talked with me." After these women had recovered from the shock of their amazement, they hastened back to the city and to the home of Elijah Mark, where they related to the 10 apostles all that had happened to them. But the apostles were not inclined to believe them. They thought at first that the women had seen a vision, but when Mary Magdalene repeated the words which Jesus had spoken to them, and when Peter heard his name, he rushed out of the upper chamber, followed closely by John, in great haste to reach the tomb and see these things for himself. The women repeated the story of talking with Jesus to the other apostles, but they would not believe, and they would not go to find out for themselves as had Peter and John. 5. Peter and John at the tomb. As the 2 apostles raced for Golgotha and the tomb of Joseph, Peter's thoughts alternated between fear and hope. He feared to meet the Master, but his hope was aroused by the story that Jesus had sent special word to him. He was half persuaded that Jesus was really alive. He recalled the promise to rise on the 3rd day. Strange to relate, this promise had not occurred to him since the crucifixion until this moment as he hurried north through Jerusalem. As John hastened out of the city, a strange ecstasy of joy and hope welled up in his soul. He was half convinced that the women really had seen the risen Master. John, being younger than Peter, outran him and arrived first at the tomb. John tarried at the door, viewing the tomb, and it was just as Mary had described it. Very soon Simon Peter rushed up and, entering, saw the same empty tomb with the grave cloth so peculiarly arranged. And when Peter had come out, John also went in and saw it all for himself, and then they sat down on the stone to ponder the meaning of what they had seen and heard. And while they sat there, they turned over in their minds all that had been told them about Jesus, but they could not clearly perceive what had happened. Peter at first suggested that the grave had been rifled, that enemies had stolen the body, perhaps bribed the guards. But John reasoned that the grave would hardly have been left so orderly if the body had been stolen, and he also raised the question as to how the bandages happened to be left behind, and so apparently intact. And again they both went back into the tomb more closely to examine the grave cloths. As they came out of the tomb the 2nd time, they found Mary Magdalene returned and weeping before the entrance. Mary had gone to the apostles, believing that Jesus had risen from the grave, but when they all refused to believe her report, She became downcast and despairing. She longed to go back near the tomb, where she thought she had heard the familiar voice of Jesus. As Mary lingered after Peter and John had gone, the Master again appeared to her, saying, "Be not doubting. Have the courage to believe what you have seen and heard. Go back to my apostles and again tell them that I have risen, that I will appear to them, and that presently I will go before them into Galilee as I promised." Mary hurried back to the Mark home and told the apostles she had again talked with Jesus, but they would not believe her. But when Peter and John returned, they ceased to ridicule and became filled with fear and apprehension.